Hello, amigo. And this is Smiley's Gardens Medically Fit. And this is the Organic Wormhole, episode 5. How you boys doing this evening? Oh,
Doing well. How you doing?
pretty good. Pretty good. Boys ready to talk some holiday organics, I guess.
Yeah, I gotta get some chats up and when I dipped out, I was gonna get the chat up, get the conversation rolling. Not sure if Carl's jumping in or not. The pharmacy seed network. Right?
Yeah, we're getting some people in the chat on YouTube. There we go.
Man, that's the second day that I've done that with YouTube on well, probably does it on your end too, tells you you're live. You can either deal with it or leave. Last 2 nights I've clicked leave for some reason. I've hit that leave button. Thank goodness that it transfers over to the guest when that happens and keeps the shit rolling. I just didn't kill it. Oh,
Oops. But that's a learning lesson, right? Learning experience.
it is. You'd think I'd have it down pat by now, but it is. So, what do you guys want to talk about this evening? Do we have a clue? Should we
Well,
questions?
Smiley, you're muted. I see you over there trying to talk, but you're muted.
I was muted. Thank you. We can always talk about the soil food web, though. I mean, there's always stuff there. I guess kind of one trippy thing that hit my mind just a minute ago was I was watching this video about just it was visualizing like the size of a DNA inside of a cell, inside all that, and it's kind of hard to, I guess, conceptualize the sizes of all these things that we talk about inside a plant or in roots or whatever. But like how the DNA was actually constructed, it had like a calcium and 4 phosphorus, and that made up this chain. But it's like when you saw the links of the chain of like how many calcium molecules were in that chain or whatever, and then it just kind of blows your mind when you see it blown out. And then you realize like every cell wall has billions of these you know what I mean? It's not just one calcium for this. So like conceptualizing the size of things and kind of the grasp of like how things can be uptaken based on what size they are. So calcium is a little bigger than other molecules. But it was kind of a cool little diagram when it just blows it out, and you see the actual cell, and you see it like you don't see the DNA no more because it's inside there. Or like a water molecule, how like a single cell will have billions of water molecules inside it. So when we think of like water flow and shit like that, it's kind of a trip.
Nice. So, what, oh, there he is. Hey, what's going on?
Like Carlton. Glad you made it, man.
Didn't know if you're going to make it tonight.
Had a little trouble with Zoom, but I'm here.
Awesome.
Nice.
Cheers, Carlton.
So, is that like, are you talking micronized size particles, Miley?
No, like the individual. So how the plant actually has to process it. Yeah, even so, we take a micronized gypsum, for example, whatever. But it's still the plant has to take that calcium and process it in different ways inside it and incorporate it inside its cells, right? Like, but it's just how big that is in proportion. You know what I'm saying? Like how super tiny, I guess it would be the way to say it, each little calcium molecule is. in proportion to a cell, you know. So now, just to create one cell, how much calcium that thing needs to uptake just to be able to create that one cell. You know? That's kind of what I was getting at. And then like the mindset that like all the biology is doing that too, right? All the bacteria in the soil is trying to do that. Is any of the living things that are trying to replicate are trying to do that. They're trying to get material to be able to replicate, right? Like they need that stuff to build the actual cells. Like,
Yeah, ideally, those all your cell walls would be made of calcium. But if you can't find it, it'll substitute other stuff.
yeah, that was the other thing I was thinking too. Is like it almost is like 3D printing itself all the time, and if it's, I guess it's kind of like if something's missing, it's gonna keep going, even so, right? And then it's almost like your printer, if your printer runs out of one of the three colors that it's using, it comes out all like goofy looking, you know, whenever you print it. Like it's almost like that, like it's trying to 3D print itself without one of the colors there to be able to do what it needs to. Yeah, I smoked a Jack Skellington cross before this, so I'm gonna go.
That's genetics.
Having a hard time hearing you, Carlton.
I think it's Smiley's fan in the background that kind of helps.
Smiley, go into the microphone and go into the audio settings and turn your Zoom filter up. It'll cut that fan out if you beef up that audio, that filter. I think that will fix it.
All right, so I know some of the stuff that I kind of was chatting with Smiley about earlier was a little bit about heavy metal uptake in plants and chelation of some of like what's happening, because we were kind of chatting about that a little bit today. Some of kind of what we chatted about was what is it, like 90 essential nutrients. Out of those 90, like 53 are considered heavy metals that your plant will uptake. And so understanding the chelation of these ions and what the soil and the soil biology can actually chelate to prevent the plant from uptaking these heavy nutrients. That's something I think that we can kind of discuss, because some people overly concerned about heavy metals, which some places, you know, being a bottled nutrient grower, I would be extremely concerned about heavy metals using bottled nutrients versus living organics. There's amendments that even I'm concerned about that I don't use so much, but the trace amounts that I use and such a big grow, I'm not overly concerned because the chelation and the soil biology. So I think that would be something we could really talk on, because a lot of people need to kind of understand some of this that aren't really educated in this area. So if you guys want to start it, we can get into it.
Absolutely. And those are actually very important. Those 90 thus far discovered 90 trace minerals that plants can use are actually really critical. Those are part of the enzyme system. They pair with enzymes. They're enzyme cofactors. So they help accelerate all those biological processes that otherwise would be really slow. And that's a huge part of the gains we get with living soils and regenerative agriculture and incorporating biology with our plant models and our soil models. Those gains come from those enzymes and those trace minerals. So I think that's a great topic to talk about, because that's a huge part of what drives such success with living soil systems.
Well, a lot of people in the living soil community have an understanding that our plants need some essential heavy metal to have homeostasis, which is a key function or balance within the plant. Because plants use essential heavy metals like iron, zinc, copper, manganese, and
Even,
go ahead.
I was just saying, even arsenic in trace amounts.
Exactly. Even lead in trace amounts for certain balances and homeostasis are key functions to make the plant work for like plant fertility.
Yep.
And so some people, like if you really dive into it, it gets deep, but we don't need to get that deep. We just need to have the basic conversation of, hey, our plants do use heavy metals. Yes, we should be concerned at a certain level of heavy metals in our soil, but if we're using certain chelation agents, different biologies, our plants will not necessarily take up those heavy metals.
Or they'll take up the appropriate chelation of the appropriate heavy metal at the appropriate amount and quantity that they need to use for the appropriate process, and only that amount.
Smiley, what do you have on some of this? Do you? Because I know we've talked about it a few times.
Well, I'm not a. I guess I would put a little definition or separation between metal and heavy metal, because there is some differentiation there, to my understanding. So some of the things that are more like on the heavier radioactive side, shit like that, right? So there's some ions that have been created, yada yada. But I don't know that it's necessarily a need for lead. I've heard nickel, I've heard cobalt, some of the other ones. I know they test for like cadmium and different things in the legal market. So there is some definite concern to be had or to take or whatever. On the other hand, I do understand that there are some biological processes that happen in the living soil too that can kind of tie up some of that stuff. So the idea that cannabis is a dynamic accumulator, and that term gets thrown around a lot. When I looked it up, the definition was more of whether the plant was able to uptake silicon or not. So it didn't really specify that it takes anything up in the soil. You know what I mean? So I do think there's maybe not as much truth to some of that either. But on the other side of things, I do know there's an oxidation and reduced state that those metals actually have to be in order to even be able to be taken out. So if they are tied up in an oxidized state, they might not even be accessible to the plants or bodies.
Well,
so
That's a very good point.
that's one ways.
iron's definitely an essential element. You know what I'm saying? So it's not necessarily considered on that like heavy metal list.
Yep. And it's one that definitely has to be in the right chelation state, or it'll actually, the plant will take it up and not be able to access good iron, because it'll take that up as an alternative to the right chelation state. It'll take up chelation states that are not correct, and it can't use those. And iron, for example, is a precursor trigger to the photosynthetic process. Well, that's a great example, iron.
Well, plants, that's the one way they adapt to heavy metals in their soil, is it's an antioxidant defense system, the RSO system. When resulting in like heavy metals in the soil, this is basically going to the enzymatic process and help with some of this, not take up some of these heavy metals. And that's why when we talk about redox, the RSO species in soil, the reactive oxygen species that are helping, this all plays a role in heavy metal chelation. And when we talk about soil biology, redox and chelation, all of it works together. And some of us, like Cheddar Bob, understanding the system is better than knowing the words. In a sense, understanding the system is what we're trying to get here. Not necessarily knowing all the words, because fuck, I still have problems pronunciating words all the time. So I think if we have a good understanding of how the system works, it doesn't really matter if we have the right terminology or word that we're using, as long as we can get it across to certain people. Because sometimes we're not always going to put out, how do I want to describe it? Like the right definition of shit sometimes, because all of us may say one definition has 3 different meanings to it, such as chelation.
Well, so there is an example like with iron. So iron in its like natural oxidized state is what, Fe3 plus 3 plus 4. Anyway, biology or bacteria will release it's an enzyme called a siderophore, I believe, but that's what starts acting on that iron in order to release it for plants and for the biology bacteria to use. So there's other forms that are available, and there was a question earlier I seen in chat about the EDTA, but there's manufactured chelating agents as well that they'll often be used for iron, for example. So a lot of the times when you get something like that, my understanding of it is those chelating agents can have effects in other ways because they don't necessarily go away, where they can actually, in order to release the iron, it exchanges at that site is my basic understanding of it. So it can actually rob a nutrient from another part of it too. So there's pluses and minuses to it, but that's one of the manufactured ways to try to deliver iron to a plant, because it's naturally going to try to react with the oxygen in the atmosphere to go back to that oxidized state.
Yeah.
So it takes physical, the thing to really comprehend, like not to go big words or anything, but the thing to really comprehend with oxidation and reduction is that oxidized state is like robbed energy. It's like dead, right? And it takes energy to reduce, to put it in a reduced or an active state. Something has to act upon it. It requires energy. That's kind of the, so to have a reduced nutrient, you can just basically think of it as having energy added into it from an oxidized state.
Yeah, and let me extend that thought a little bit, just for conceptually, that what you're talking about there is basically we're using the plant as a transducer. It is literally an antenna for collecting light energy and other energy forms from the air and extracting that energy. So the plant is reducing the soil, and like the system is like working the other way in oxidation in the atmosphere, right? It's really interesting process that it's all about energy exchange. The plant's capturing energy from the sun, and then that energy is exchanged down to those biology, and then they're using that energy to mine nutrients out and feed back to the plant. It's an ongoing cycle. It's really fascinating when you think about it that way.
Now, there were some articles that I sent you to earlier this evening about different methods of chelation and different soil remedies to help, I guess, prevent the uptake of heavy metals, help to pull heavy metals out. And one of them was like a soil wash, not necessarily a soil drench, but washing it with certain chemicals. Because they were talking about 2 different processes of doing it. One with a chemical wash, and the other is like an organic type of chelation process, which is pretty interesting because I haven't heard anybody really talk about a chelation wash of soil to help prevent the uptake of heavy nutrients. I've heard of using different amino acids, like fish enzymes and stuff like that, to help with soil remediation. But I haven't really heard them talk about doing these soil drenches to help with this.
The only thing that I've heard along those lines up until you just shared those articles tonight was along the lines of using magnetized structured water, and they were using it to take out, I think it was primarily pesticides, primarily I think glyphosate they were testing on, and they found that magnetically charged structured water was able to take it out of the upper soil system, but then the problem was it took it into the lower soil system because it apparently it was only able to move it so far before it deposited it again, basically, right? But that's interesting. I feel like that's a backwards approach from using the biology and letting the biology do the work. I mean, at the core of what we're all talking about here, it's like we're going to put all the pieces in play in the right balance and ratio chemically as best we can. And then we're going to put all the biology that we know is appropriate as best we can. And we're going to let the biology regulate that entirely. And that's really what the living system is. And that's why this planet still got life on it at all.
Well, some of the same processes that we use in soil to help prevent uptakes of heavy metals, the chelation part, we do as humans as well. We put certain chelation drinks into our body that attaches themselves to heavy metals in our body to help remove these toxins as we urinate, piss them out. And so some of the same processes that the plant and the biology use, we as humans do the same process.
One, a great example of that is bentonite clay. People use that for detoxifying their body, and it works great in soils too. That clay just locks those toxins up. And that's back to that conversation we had a while back where we talked a little bit about the clay colloids. Those clay colloids can lock up and unlock tremendous amount of nutrition and a tremendous amount of chemicals too. I mean, that clay is so flexible, such a powerful tool.
So Smiley started answering the question, what is chelation?
Chelation's like I don't know, the base of the word is claw, if I remember right. So it's kind of like a claw. But the way I envision that is it's a way of tying up the electrical charge of a molecule.
The ions, the bonding ions.
So like I guess the way I've always envisioned fulvic acid working is like if you have parts of a molecule floating around that have charges to it, they can take up those charge sites to change the dynamic of that molecule. And it can do it in a way that, that'll allow for uptake or not. There's, in an organic sense, I believe it's actually speaking of it being tied with carbon too. It was like a part of that in the organic chemistry side, but
Well, that's the nice thing about like fulvic humic substances. Like the acid itself has functional groups that will enable it to form steady complexes and not allow it to bond or to be uptaken. Which, like, how do I describe it? If we're concerned about these heavy metals in our soils, and everybody's talking, oh my gosh, we got to watch these nutrients that we're using with heavy metals, kelp, azomite, bottled nutrients. How come more and more people aren't talking about fulvic and humic acids like we are about preventing and the chelation of the uptake of these? Because we all know that the research is there. So why are people, in a sense, creating fear in this industry? Oh my God, heavy metals, when there are ways to deal with these contaminants in the soil and prevent the uptake in our plants.
I can't speak on it for a matter of fact because I've never really had my stuff tested for heavy metals, so I don't know.
I'll say, like, I hear that too a lot, but I'm hearing that in like the big commercial industry. And I feel like the commercial industry is warranted to be looked at for any sort of shortcuts or shady stuff, right? Because, like, I mean, we look at what corporations have done over the centuries. Do I need to say any more than that? But on the small scale, I will say this. I've never tested for heavy metals either. Never had to. Kind of wish I had over the years, for sure. Now my amendments, I get them from Kiss Organics. I know they're testing all their stuff regularly, all their suppliers, they're testing regularly for heavy metals and other contaminants. So like one thing, it's a little more expensive for me to ship from California and to buy from them. But you know what? I know it's clean when I get it. And that's a nice place to start, to not have to like worry about where am I putting contaminants into my own soil. So
That's always been my question to some of these people. Where am I getting contaminants to be concerned about my soils having heavy metals in it? Do you know? Because a lot of people like to talk out here like they know, but I personally know. I mean, down to earth amendments, you can go to their website, and for every product they have a MSDS sheet. They have every nutrient listed in their amendment. The azomite, it even shows that it tests higher in aluminum, but not where it's a concerning level. But you can see their test and what they're testing at. Okay, so now I know that azomite has a higher aluminum content. So do I use as much azomite? No. And if I'm using for a bell, a cup of azomite for a 3 deal bell, let's think about how much trace aluminum is now in my soil. Is it concerning or alarming that I need to be worried about? Hell no.
Yep.
Hell no.
Yep. And also you got to consider the metal itself. Aluminum is highly reactive. We don't even have aluminum, like the aluminum we have that is not painted. When you see that surface on that, you're not looking at aluminum. You're looking at aluminum oxidation. That stuff oxidizes nearly instantaneously as soon as it's exposed to the atmosphere. So you got to imagine small particles of that, even in the soil, they're going to oxidize very quickly and be locked up. So like aluminum, maybe not so concerning. Cadmium, well, maybe that's a different charge. Maybe that's much more concerning because it's a different metal also, but also because of its charge and how it interacts. So other things to consider in this.
Some of these heavy metals that you're talking about, especially on the industrial level that you were talking about earlier, Carlton, the corners that they cut, a lot of outside of, organics in the soil and stuff, the deodorants you use have way more aluminum in them. The cans that you're drinking out of, what is acceptable as heavy metals in your everyday, I'm sure the foods that you eat have a lot more heavy metals in them. And that's in a consumption form where you're actually going into your body and the heavy metals are able to communicate or communicate. Sorry, you know what I'm trying to say here. Communicate.
Accumulate.
There you go. Build up in your system. Thank you, Maddie. Build up in your system to where they're actually in a molecule form. Say now, when we talk about the plant uptaking them and something being in your cannabis, are we really talking about? I mean, especially with something like a heavy metal, before it actually becomes. I mean, are we actually heating it up hot enough to where we're talking about it actually not making it any further than your ash? You know what I mean? I understand it's in there, but is it burning hot enough? You know what I mean? And I'm not saying that's, acceptable that it's in the plant, but how much of it is actually making it into your system? And a lot of these heavy metals that we're talking about, us as well as the plant, need those heavy metals to actually do what they're doing. You know what I mean? As you're talking about, there's different enzymes and fulvic acids and stuff. In us, it's the fulvic acid that starts breaking down the minerals and stuff, making it available for our systems. So, when we talk about heavy metals, as you talked about medically fit earlier on, how much of this is bad and, how much is actually acceptable? Or, you know what I mean? Are we actually going too far and being, a little bit crazy about what's acceptable in the soil and then in the end product here?
Well, from a home grower's view, I think some of us are overly concerned about it. I mean, I'm more concerned if I was a bottled feeding grower versus an organic grower, because there's so much more heavy metals in the bottled nutrients than what people really understand that there is. And you can even look at the MSDS sheets and all the information on them about the contaminants of heavy metals to them. As for a large cultivation facility for a dispensary, when I'm being tested, I would then be concerned about my levels in my soil, yes, because if I have to test for these in the end product and it's showing in my end product, then I must have high amounts of heavy metals for my plant to be pulling up. So I'm going to need to look at my soil, where it's coming from, what nutrients I'm using, because there's a lot of facilities that are doing this to eliminate those heavy metal probabilities in their end product.
Yep. And actually, in the last few podcasts, that same company, Kiss Organics, Tad Hussey or whatever, they did an episode on heavy metal contamination. They were talking more on the commercial industry scale of things. So worth a listen to understand their perspective of it from a commercial scale. Then I know some of the guys here, are more commercial growers, but a lot of us aren't. A lot of us are smaller scale. And so, I guess for us to try to look at it from a commercial perspective is kind of a moot point. Right? Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I mean, most of us aren't growing at that level to be concerned about it, honestly. If I had a large facility that I was producing for people, yes, I would look more into it. But as a home cultivator, I am not using enough nutrients in my soil to be concerned about it. I am not going through pounds and pounds of down to earth products in my product. A 5-pound box will last me almost 2 years or longer in cultivation. So I'm not using, what's that, Carl?
I was gonna say I haven't rock dust in like a decade. Still, I'm still running the same rock dust for a decade. I can't tell you how many batches of soil I've mixed on that,
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I would be concerned about some of the foods that we're getting from the stores that are being farmed out, like look at tomatoes and peppers and anything else that pull up these other heavy, they're not heavy dynamic accumulators, but they're dynamic accumulators just as well. And so when we're looking at certain produce that we continue to consume, I mean, there's regulation on that shit just as well. So,
and
it's
going to be exposed to more and more scrutiny and testing over time too, from a commercial standard. That is up and coming. That's on the table, in the conversation, and going to continue to be more of the conversation. And
honestly, Eagle,
that is the big, because it's what you're eating. Go ahead.
My biggest concern about heavy metal contamination is fucking the chemtrails that we keep getting fucking pounded every day from. Yep. Because if you looked at the amount of heavy metals that are being sprayed and contaminated our air, and if you actually watch the powdery residue that falls on vehicles or like a surface and you use a magnet to them, you'll see the magnet pull all that heavy dust up. Like that shit is being sprayed on us every day versus what's in my soil. So if I'm cultivating outdoors, I would be really concerned about heavy metal contamination on my plants and in my soils.
That's a big argument for high tunnels for outdoor.
Big takeaway would be to be mindful of your inputs, like try to maybe not pick as maybe you don't have to have as many inputs, you know what I mean? Maybe there are some things that you don't necessarily need to replace and just take out.
Yep. And maybe check if you are running bottled nutrients, maybe go take a look at their MSDS sheet, look up some, independent testing reviews if you can find them, find out what's in it, make sure you're not contaminating yourself.
Well, and it's funny because some people don't believe in chemtrails, but you can actually do the research and look up geoweather engineering, and it is research documented. And there is white paperwork on the research that they've been doing for decades. Not only you have many different countries in this globe admitting to using geoweather engineering and spraying chemtrails for cloud seeding. So do the research if you don't believe in it.
Yep. Yep.
So
And then all you got to do is observe weather patterns, and you'll start to notice that they spray the skies up about 3 days before a rain front comes through or a snow front comes through. You'll start to notice that pattern. You go, oh, holy shit. You'll look at the forecast and go, oh, it's supposed to rain on Saturday. Oh, it's Thursday. And look at that. Those chemtrails are going up again. Wow. What an interesting coinky dink.
So what are the, I mean, some of the heavy metals, you're considering toxic. What are some of the signs in you? Because a lot of people don't necessarily test their soils to see a lot of these things are, accumulating in high amounts in their soil. So how can you tell, how can somebody that doesn't necessarily or can't afford to have their soil tested often, how can they see signs of heavy metal accumulation or buildup in the soil? And what are some of the things that you guys are talking about, that you can add to the soil that will, help remediate it?
So first of all, I think heavy metal testing for soil is pretty cheap now. I think they were talking about it being like $35 for the test. So
Something maybe up to $60, something like that. Not real expensive for just some soil testing.
So that's in the home grower range. Like if you're spending 30 to 50 to $60 on a bottle of nutrients, you can afford a test if you're concerned, right? Like that's like something worth checking out. While you're at it, get a nutrient test, figure out where your soil's at, get that balance. And you don't need that damn bottle.
But fulvic acid, humic acids would be the two substances that I would look at using for the chelation and the uptake of it in your soil. If you tested and had it to be found where it's a heavier amount in your soil than what is recommended. But as for it, aluminum's one of them, barium, cadmium, manganese, these are all toxic or can be toxic in heavy amounts. And when I mean heavy amounts, I am talking more than nanograms of this, more than micrograms of this can be toxic to humans, let alone your plants. So when I'm talking about the amounts, these are trace amounts, nanogram amounts, which are smaller than micrograms. So some people, that way you can understand the difference in the molecule size and the amount that is being used or allowed.
1 nanogram being 1/1000th of a gram. So
What are some of the soil inputs that most people use to carry these heavy metals, and what are some of the alternatives they could use to get around?
I know more on the dry organic side. It's stuff like kelp, seaweed, extracts, meals. They're higher in aluminum, mercury contents. Mercury is another heavy metal that's really toxic. The other is like azomite are the basic ones that are higher in these heavy metals that are being tested time and time again to be found with heavy metals found in them. So think about kelp. Kelp's from the sea. It pulls up all these heavy metals and mercury from the sea floor, the seabed. Same thing as seaweed. Azomite are all these macronutrients from volcanic rock dust, basalt. They contain whatever the volcano is blowing out for nutrients. And so those are the ones I understand. Now, when it comes to bottled nutrients, you're going to have to look at the manufacturer because there's a lot of them. I don't remember exact brands. And I'm not going to just throw names out there unless I actually remember which ones. But those are the ones that I would look at as who and where their products are being manufactured, because some of those have kelp, has trace macro like azomite, rock dust to them. So those would be my suggestions.
also, let's just briefly cover real quick how many of those bottled nutrients are extracted. Most of those are mined rock, and then they extract that with either sulfuric acid or some other extreme process. And then they refine the slurry they get out of that to create your nutrient, the concentration that you want of whatever NPK, trace minerals, whatever you want in that is extracted from that mining process. So it's an incredibly energy intensive process right from the start. And so also just to understand how can those heavy metals end up in there with extreme acids like that, you can pretty much liquefy anything, and that includes heavy metals. So that's how they can end up in those liquid products, just as an understanding of the process.
So I mean, Mother Nature's a crazy system. I mean, if these same things were left alone in nature, microorganisms in general would adapt and start to eat and break down these things. So how come our living soil beds aren't necessarily adapting? Are they being added too quickly, or is it actually at a shortage? Are we not inoculating enough? Is there
Biology.
It's
the problem? Rather than dumping more on, is there, a problem that the system isn't working correctly? That there is a buildup.
Well, it comes to a couple different things. Biology is one of them. There are different bacteria and fungi that will help remediate heavy metals in soil. Now, do we use them to cultivate and grow with? Most of the time, not likely. So we're not going to find them in most of the products we use for our beds for dumping biologicals or different soil biology into it, and these different nutrients or bottles that we get. The other is some pH level, redox, are some of the other key things we need to pay attention to with this. But if you look at just bacteria alone, for decades we were concerned about plastics, for example. Oh, plastics are contaminating our soil. Plastics all over. They're not going to break down for thousands of years. All of a sudden, in the last 10 years, we found a bacteria that actually consumes plastics and breaks it down. So over time, I am sure Mother Nature creates biology that breaks all this shit down. Have we found the specific ones? I'm sure some of the companies doing research have, but it just hasn't trickled down to us knowing which ones they are.
Well, and here's another spin on that too. Not only are we finding more and more new bacteria every day that will consume and live in different temperature ranges and pH ranges. Like, look at the recent study stuff that's done at the bottom of the ocean. We got freaking worms down there at 700 degrees at some, like, I don't know, 50 atmospheres of pressure. Like, insane conditions you would never think any creature could survive, right? That's just living creatures, right? And then if you go over to fungi, and this is something we're incorporating in our living soils. We use mycorrhizal fungi, endomycorrhizal fungi, and we're finding more and more of these relationships with plants and soils, right? But like Paul Stamets did a video called "The Future is Fungi" a while back. I think it was like 2009, might have been 2012. He talked about all of the different roles that they were studying in fungi remediating toxins in the environment. And one of the ones they talked about was they were able to go to radioactive toxic sites, and there was a specific fungi that would actually tie up and chelate that radiation. And when they picked that fungi out of that site and tested it, it doesn't have any radiation. It literally destroyed the radiation, broke it down. So, and this again goes back to what we've been saying all along in every one of these conversations: is biology is the trump card of this. So if we get all the biology in there, we have a much better chance of chelating the bad stuff, enhancing the good stuff, and building a community. And those communities will help exchange with each other. But I just wanted to extend that thought about the different ranges that biology can actually inhabit and the different capabilities that it actually has. That's just bacteria and fungi that we understand to date. We've only listed about 20,000 species of fungi, and there are probably millions more to learn about. So just some things to take home and think about in this conversation.
It's funny you bring up the fungi aspect of it, because that's something I've kind of wondered about as we've talked about organics and like the beginning of starting of a bed. You know what I mean? How do you, where's a good step with that other than, throw in some basic dry microbes in the soil and mixing it up there? I mean, how can you get a good jump start on mycology and fungi and everything in your soil and, keep it up? I mean, and on top of that, can you add, slowly add different species, to the dirt to diversify? You know what I mean? To for up and building the immune system. And that's how I see that. So, every so often, you get sick. You build up a resistance to that. I think that's what you're doing with the soil too. I mean, is that not correct?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And every conversation I hear around regenerative agriculture, especially like the breaking edge stuff that I listen to, these guys are always talking about like, well, look at that. Every time we put diversity in there, boy, do we get the trump card back out. We get gains back out. We get plant disease and pest resistance back out. We get soil remediation, carbon sequestration, all those pieces that we want to see in our soils that makes our soils what they are. It's that diversity, right? And so, like, yeah, I think it is building the immune system. I think it's we could keep adding. There are certain ones like mycorrhizal fungi can't survive without a plant, right? They need to pair with a plant just to operate. So those need to go in and on your seed right off the bat. Get them paired with your seeds immediately. Do that as much as you can with your biology, and then keep adding biology to your soil. They talk about that too in a lot of these webinars from John Kempf and stuff, where somebody will inoculate at seeding and then still they go back and they keep putting it down despite, recommendations that you don't need to put those inoculants down anymore. We should have it, but they put them down 3 weeks later and they put them down 3 weeks later again and they get gains with it. And so, yeah, I say
Well,
keep adding it.
keep
Keep
in
it
mind when you're adding certain biology that a teaspoon to tablespoon has millions of colonies in
Yeah.
that fucking tablespoon.
Yeah.
So you don't need to keep adding a whole bunch like tablespoon, like 5 tablespoons. No, understand that the trace amounts that will work for you in your soil or your feedings. But fungi, Eagle, to keep fungi around, you need carbon sources. You need woody, hard, dense materials that fungi really like to eat and consume. Bacteria, they don't need like woody substances to live or to find sources of food to kind of stay in the soil. So that's why a lot of people, when they're talking about using different mixes, they're using their compost. Well, compost most of the times has different ratios of wood to green type ratios. And so that's going to be a key component in keeping some of this biology active and alive when you start your bed. Using certain products, though, is kind of a hindrance. So, yucca, great example. And there's a reason why. People enjoy using yucca for the saponins and some of the sugar content to yucca. But yucca actually kills certain fungus. So why do I want to add yucca to my feedings if it's killing some of the biology I'm looking for in my soil? So you really have to pay attention to certain amendments when you're adding them and understanding the benefits and the harmfulness of the use of them. So I don't mind using yucca and I use it in tea feedings, but I don't like top dress with it. I use it in small amounts. I know that if I'm doing it, I'm going to have to re-amend with some of the fungus back into my soil. So yeah, you got to kind of be.
That was what I was gonna get to is like I think the best way to think of an inoculation is like in the sense of some of the prebiotics there for what you're trying to build. So if you got, fungi you want to build, you're gonna need to have a food source for them to grow on, right? You're gonna need that biology to have a food source to grow on. The other best way to inoculate is not any bugs in a jug or any brand, but to find a quality, what's now considered the biocomplete kind of compost. But you're gonna have it, that means it's been looked at as far as having a quantifiable amount of these beneficial parts of the soil food web, which include the fungi and include the higher level nematodes and protozoa and the things that you don't get in some of the bottled inoculants. But that's kind of where my brain's always gone as far as like thinking of that soil food web is like really to build that, you know, if there's nothing there for say the fungi to feed on, I mean, you're basically throwing all this, anything you inoculate in there is being like thrown into this desert scenario where it doesn't, you know what I mean? It doesn't have food, it doesn't have shit, right? Like,
And so
yeah, you want to have them have some kind of an environment, and part of that is actually in the aeration of the growing media or the soil that you're working with. And that's important because all the soil food web and all that biology has to have oxygen to be able to metabolize and be able to move around and be able to do what they do. So that's the other dichotomy of it is this the actual structure of that soil plays a role in what actually is going to be sustained in that ecosystem, you know.
Absolutely.
can that be added, through say biochar or semi-rotted, composted woods, for aeration and it pre-inoculated, a fungi source, giving it a jump start. And I'm sure if there was enough, a few chunks in your bed there, they would jump to jump. That web would jump. I'm 100% on that. They'd find each other, create that web that you're looking for.
So let's tie all these pieces together because we all touched on different pieces of it, right? But at the end of the day, you want that biology to have a place to live so it can thrive and replicate, right? So it needs a home, it needs a temperature range that is comfortable, it needs enough moisture but not too much, it needs food, right? It needs energy exchange sites, right? So think about that environment that you want to create in the soil to facilitate that.
So what I just heard is a layer, a horizon almost is,
What
you
you heard was a definition of an environment, right?
huh, making like their own, like maybe just wood chippy layer just a few inches under the soil, would that be a thing? Could that be a thing?
It could be. You got to be careful with wood chips because they can tie up a lot of nitrogen on you. I wouldn't go crazy with those. But a little bit of some wood particles in there is part of that equation, right? There's some lignin for the fungi that chew on lignin to work on, like a diversity of foods for a diversity of bacteria and fungi is really kind of what we want, right? And those trace minerals are part of this conversation because those are part of those critical enzyme cofactors for all life, from the protozoa up to the biggest size life, right? For lack of a better word. So I just want to tie those pieces together so you can think of it conceptually from the perspective of what we're trying to do is provide an environment that's comfortable and has food and lets that biology thrive and replicate. And as long as it can thrive and replicate, it'll keep thriving and replicating and interacting on into the future with the plants that we put in those soils.
And I just want to say, I wouldn't say that biochar is an aeration. It's going to be more water holding.
And a home for biology, from my understanding, it's more of a home for biology. It's a place for it.
Well, the biology don't really like. So there's a new thought on some of that. So like, biology is not really moving in and out of a home. You know what I mean? They pretty much grow on the food they're eating. Like, that's the other side of it. And like, at the point, if you've done biochar correctly, it's, to my understanding, it's like a carbon glass almost, to where there really isn't much that they can do as far as releasing energy for their life cycles on it. There's some new thought line of thinking on some of that too, so it's not, yeah.
It's ever evolving. I know that. That's interesting. I'll be curious to hear where that goes.
I mean,
cool.
you get what I was the line of thinking. It's not really like the bacteria is gonna be
No, no.
migrating from the biochar to their food source, right? They just grow right on the food source.
I think
But with that being said, the life always wants to have a way. You know what I mean? That's indeed a life. If you know your food source is running out or whatever, I mean, do you die off or do you venture out?
and that's that's a thing where this like bacteria and fungi differ from us at that, right? We can't like dehydrate ourselves and hang out for 100 years, and then when we find an environment that's suitable, come back and thrive again. Like we can't go dormant, right? But a lot of these bacteria and fungi can. They can hang out, and they can live like if you look at soil, if you go down to that little aggregate like Smiley was talking about, and then you zoom in on that on a microscopic scale, the amount of moisture that's in that little particle, even when that particle feels dry to us, is enough to sustain life for so much longer than we realize. The bacteria and fungi that can work on that microscopic scale and that microscopic amount of moisture can go on way further than we could ever expect. That's one of the things that I've learned through a lot of this regenerative stuff. Really fascinating. But I've always heard the biochar referred to in the context of not like as you say, like not so much at home. I've heard people inoculate it and then put it in the soil so it carries the inoculant with it. And for me, if that's like if you think about like carbon, especially like charcoal or something like that, where it's been high temperature, right? It's going to crack and have all these really fine particulate surface areas. There's lots of surface area to bond to and hang out on until you find a food source in a suitable environment. And so maybe it applies there. I know I've heard and seen lots of people say they swear that the biochar has given them excellent results. And I still haven't seen any science that points to anything that says, that it actually holds biology or that it adds anything to the soil or what it does exactly, but it seems to produce results. So who knows? Maybe it's just a crystal structure, but I don't know.
What not? All right. So we've talked about biochar. What about like say a composted or half rotted wood? You know,
So
how
I'm just
does that work in the system?
best compost from everything I understand from the Johnson Sioux bioreactor. So that's compost that sat for about a year, and it's going to be very high in carbon. And like Smiley was talking about, that well compost and stuff is like it's going to have all that diversity again of biology. So that's my 2 cents on it. I'll let these guys.
I'm sorry, Igor. What was the question again?
What will it, we talked about biochar. What about adding like a half rotted or a composted wood that was inoculated with fungi or whatever already had. It's just like the same thing of like taking a microbes from outside, adding them in there. They're on the rotted wood. You add them to the system. It's already the fungi's already breaking down the wood, and you've just kind of added it. Is there a benefit to that?
I mean, there's saprophytic fungi play a role in this.
Is that enough of a food source to keep it? I guess that's the question.
Well, you got to consider too, like when you're wild sourcing like that, that not necessarily everything's going to be beneficial to cannabis or whatever garden you're growing. So there is some of that to kind of consider as well. But like, yeah, I mean, if you wanted to try to get some of them saprophytic, you're definitely gonna by grabbing a handful of them and putting them in there, they're gonna be in it. So.
I wonder if cocoa would be a good medium outside of the organic system right there. My chunky cocoa. I wonder if you could. That would be an environment that you could incorporate a good fungi system in. They seem like they would indeed break down that cocoa shit when it was the bokashi. Holy shit, man! When you sent me the earth boxes and Brandon Russ sent over the bokashi and all the stuff that he sent, that bokashi destroyed that fucking cocoa. Destroyed a brand new. I mean, when the chunky cocoa I use is like 1/2 inch to maybe 5 inch chunky, marbles basically, and I've used it a few runs. and it gets finer and finer per run, breaks down through the roughness, breaking down, and just you beating it up from transplanting it kind of roughs it up, breaks it down. But you get a few good runs. That Bokashi, that was a fresh round with that cocoa. And that shit turned that round of cocoa to dust by the end of the run. That shit was like powdery, broken. It was no longer chunky in the end of the first round. So, obviously that shit can be, utilized by that kind of stuff. So would it add, and with that being said, would it add like CO2 to my room? I mean, Gus grows, there's people out there adding fungi to their soils and, making it work. Um, is it something we should be thinking about to help keeping the balance in play here?
Yeah, that's one of the metrics for measuring like how biologically active a soil is. It's like the amount of CO2 it can produce. Yeah, it's definitely something that adds CO2 to the room.
Yeah, and the shit, I lost my train of thought. Never mind. It'll come back maybe. Hate when that happens.
But that's a real sign of that active biology, the fact that stuff, those fibers are able to be broken down. That's one thing to kind of look at even when you're doing your own soils is like I've had times where you add stuff like say a top dressing or whatever, and it just sits there like it didn't do shit, until you really get like a compost extract or some kind of form to kickstart the biology, and then you really see that stuff start to really decompose or decay. It's crazy, but
Yeah,
the bokashi is a decomposing set of biology, so it's definitely doing its thing.
yeah. And I'll share an experience on that too. I had at the farm when I started using the inoculants from Advancing Eco Agriculture. When I started incorporating those into my foliar feeds and my nutrition program, and I started getting those soils like just starting to get them aligned, and my tomato crop started to really take off. There was a year I put down probably 8 or 12 inches of heavy. It was like field mown mulch. It was like straw basically, but more fibrous than that. It was really like dense lignin material. And I put that down thinking, man, that'll hold me for the summer. I shouldn't have to mulch again until like late summer, early fall. And man, in a month it was gone because those inoculants and that biology took off and it just ate it all up. And it was amazing because it fed it to the tomatoes. It was obvious the growth was just explosive. But then I found myself chasing mulch the rest of the season. Every month I'm putting 6 or 8 inches on, and it's just sucking away. And then later on, I went back and listened to another seminar from AEA, and he was talking about how fast that mulch goes when you get the biology in the soil right. I was like, shit, man, he's right. It really takes off when it catches fire. It's amazing. So yeah, I mean, they're definitely an important role. And let's remember, those saprophytic fungi aren't going to attack living plants. They only attack dead tissue.
And they're really only going to be playing a role in the nutrient cycling. So,
Right.
There's other things that are playing roles as well. I don't know if it's in a bed, it might be something you can get better. I've never had really good luck, I should say, establishing a good like fruiting mushroom out of any of the soils.
I have, but mostly outdoor in crates and in soil pots. I've found that harder to do. Though I have seen it post inoculations when I do the BioCoat Gold inoculation, and that really takes. And I see the visual results in the growth within a month or so. I'll see little mushrooms popping up in the beds or in the soil planters or the pots from it. So it's kind of interesting. You can almost kind of see when the biology actually catches when you put an inoculant down. You can see the results of that over time. Or at least that's what I've observed thus far.
So is there any in particular ones that are, I mean, just like anything else, I would think there's good and bad fungi that would signal, okay, I'm seeing this in particular mushroom up top. That should tell me that there's, X in the system that's they're eating off of. Or I'm seeing this, you know, little yellow mushroom pop up. You know what I mean? Is different types just like, are they like little flags? Is there good, bad? I see you. Everything's on check. I see you. If something's fucked up. Something's fucked up. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here. There's too much of something here. You know what I mean? The soil swayed this, but is there fungi that's cannabis friendly? We've already nailed it down to mycelia that's fucking cannabis friendly, different strains that but so is there
Well,
different? Go ahead,
that's
Mike.
kind of the thing, some of the research that like Dr. Lang Ingham has done and talked about. Some of like the cannabinoid profile alone from having a bacterial dominant soil to a fungal dominant soil changes tremendously. And the bacterial dominant soil seems to have a higher THC content to it versus the fungal dominant soil, which is really interesting. But if you really understand seed succession, plant succession, you'll understand that seed bearing plants are more of a fungal or a bacterial dominant soil where they like more bacterial to fungal ratios. But a lot of people try to say cannabis is more of a 1-to-1 to fungal dominant. But when you look at the results from what Langingham had talked about, the bacteria shows higher THC levels. So right there tells me it's more of a bacterial dominant soil that it enjoys versus a fungal. So, it's to each their own. What do you prefer? You want a higher CBD or different cannabinoids? Then maybe have that fungal dominant component.
And yet, one of the other talks I heard recently, they were talking about the fungal component and how that affected terpene content. So again, I want to see diversity of biology, and I want to put the plant in the soil and pair it with the biology as best I can, make sure that all those nutrition levels are balanced, and then let the biology and the plant work out what's best. And then,
but if you look at the resin glands, how it's been bacteria that's been mainly found in the resin heads and not so much fungal, it kind of makes you wonder on some of this, on what's happening with the secondary metabolites and with them ending up in the resin gland itself.
and I'm just gonna say, like with all the information we're covering here, like at the end of the day, the more I learn, the more questions I have than answers, unfortunately. Sadly.
It's it's a continuing education, because if you think that you've learned everything, I'm sorry, but you haven't. Because
one time you're
even doing this is doing this as long as I have, I'm still learning. Plants physiology and soil biology is ever growing and expanding with new knowledge and information. And every few years, something else comes out about, like the recent one was the rhizophagy cycle by Dr. James White. And that's blown the doors open for the soil food web and what's happening. And now it's about endophytes, and it's big about endophytes. And we weren't talking about endophytes 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So it's always changing. That's why you have to keep up on educating yourself when it comes to a lot of this information.
And that goes for
It's
just
exactly changing though, because I was digging into that when that whole rhizophagy cycle thing popped off, and a lot of those are in the microbe life. I was looking at the bottle. And the ones they were talking about are like a lot of those are already in like microbe life and like some of the other additives that are bugs in a jug or whatever. But I just found that interesting that we're already utilizing them. I guess they just maybe didn't realize exactly how everything was functioning at
well,
its own level.
Well, even James White talked about, it was the Australians that found it before he did, and that was what, in the 80s.
and then at the end of the day, like we've been inoculating like beans and legumes and stuff with rhizophagy type bacteria for forever, knowing that that enhanced them. But we just had no idea that it worked on pretty much all plants. Duh. Oh no, it only works on these. Well, guess what? It works on a lot more than we thought. And hey, guess what? The air is 78% nitrogen. Do we really need to add liquid nitrogen to anything? Probably not much.
So is it one of those things that where you talking about it's like 1 to 1? Could it be that the bacteria is charging things in the soil and the fungi aspects of it's coming from above the air or vice versa? Helping the plant on the plant surface or the trichome head surface and
Well, I think it's a combination of more than that. It's some of the fungus is breaking down certain nutrients that are allowing the plant to take up. You have endophytics, you have ecto. So endo means going in, ecto means outside. So you have these two type of fungus in the soil. So some of them are working with the plant and some of them are not. But like the mycorrhizae, they will go out and find nutrients and bring it back to the plant and take it into the plant, where some of the ecto will only break it down. So it's really having a good, to me, ratio of biology. And I would say even a 1 to 1, it's hard. It's honestly hard to know the ratio you're doing in your soil, especially when you're adding all these different bottled biology or different amendments that have biology to it. You can't really tell if what ratio you're getting without doing soil tests and samples under a microscope or something to really see where you're at. We can shoot and hope for things without that, but that's kind of the concerning thing. Look at the products that you use. What's the ratio of fungus per bacteria? You're going to see there's more bacteria in some of these than there are fungus. So you're not quite getting like a 1-to-1 ratio.
And also, like if you take and consider, again, I keep losing my train of thought. I was going to pick something up that you were saying there, but I lost it now. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
so what is the lifespan on some of these organisms? How often, we talked about re-inoculating earlier a little bit. You were talking to Mehdi, like there's in a handful or a teaspoon, there's billions and billions, but what's the lifespan? I know like myself, my gut, I'm drinking kombucha every day. There's billions and billions of fucking cultures in there. You know what I mean? Do I think tomorrow I don't want to drink one because I drank 10 billion yesterday? No, I'm going to drink another kombucha tomorrow. What's the life cycle here?
Do you understand how fast cells replicate?
You have to understand it.
That's the lifespan of a bacteria or a fungi. They only last seconds to minutes. They have to reproduce and keep producing. They don't live long. Now, they can be in an animated suspension in a sense where they're not quite dead or the colonies died off, where once they can get rehydrated, they kind of reanimate. So the species can stay around, colony can stay around, but for the individual cell itself, they don't last that long at all. And that's why if you don't have colonies established in your soil, why it is important to keep re-inoculating.
And an excellent example of that, of bacterial replication, just look at E. coli. We try to keep a piece of chicken clean from getting infected. You get one E. coli bacteria on there and it sits out in the right environment. And sure enough, that whole piece of meat is contaminated in no time, hours, right? So that turnover rate, that replication rate for bacteria is phenomenally fast. Some of them literally operate in microseconds. So what we're trying to do is keep that going. Let's also, you correlated to the human body, the digestive tract. Let's just make that point again too. The human digestive tract, as we know, is the gut, right? The stomach and the gut and all those different pH ranges. That's important for us as it is for soil. The soil is the digestive tract of the plant. And it also has multiple ranges of pHs, multiple nutrient concentrations, multiple ranges of everything. And then those biology, those bacteria and fungi work in pairs together, and they even work in chains together. He talked about the biology inside the root, outside the root, the biology that's inside and outside the root, the biology that's outside the root only depositing nutrients on the outside of the root. Well, the biology on the outside of the root pulls that nutrient from the biology that deposited on the outside of the root. And the biology that got that nutrient got it from nutrient next to it. It's exchanged through, right? Just trying to paint the model picture here for you.
Do a good job of it.
I think it really matters too, like what you're talking about, because life cycles of like fungi and some of the other protists or nematodes, some of those life cycles can be a lot longer, but they're also can be a little more fragile in the environment that they're in or subjected to. So yeah, there's certain things where like bacteria is going to reproduce a lot faster, and it's interesting because I think the bacteria has that like lower like carbon and nitrogen ratio, more like a 1-to-1, whereas some of the bigger organisms have like more carbon demand. So they're actually trying to, when they're consuming those bacteria, they're incorporating the carbon more than the nitrogen. So majority of the waste becomes like the nitrogen form of a waste or whatever. So there's kind of a cool little way of thinking about that too, as far as like how that carbon cycle moves through the different.
That makes a lot of sense when I think about it. We think about, like, I don't know if you guys have ever experimented with growing mushrooms yet or not, but when you think about how much more carbon you need in a medium for growing mushrooms versus how much you need in a medium for growing like plants, there is a huge difference there. That's an interesting correlation.
So what, I guess I'm curious now, what keeps this in check? So we're talking about initially, buildups in the systems, heavy metals. We've added, bacteria and stuff to keep that in check and break it down. Energy's not destroyed, it's transferred. So what keeps the bacteria and the shit that it's putting out, dying off, shitting out? There's a buildup, there's a transfer of energy in there. What's the next step down the chain? What's keeping all this in check? It's a cycle.
That's your soil food web, though. That's your protozoists, your protists, your arthropods, microarthropods, things like that are consuming the bacteria and fungi. Because the only way to release the nutrients that most of them hold in their body is for them to be consumed or die. So the rhizophage cycle says that plants' root tips will actually eat these bacteria, eat their outer layers off and kind of spit them back out, which
come out.
In a sense, that's like consuming, like the part of the soil food web.
Like us eating a fish, just eat the fish, leave the backbone, move on.
Well, it's a lot deeper than that, but yeah.
The concept.
But that's the stuff that really keeps everything in the soil in check. And like when people first start talking, biology, you need bacteria, you need fungi in your soil. Well, you need more than that, because those are going to break down certain things and then kind of lock nutrients up and not make it available for your plant if nothing's consuming them, eating the carbon sources and releasing those nutrients. And that's why, like, one of the things I've always talked about is protists are very important as part of what you're putting in your soil. Them and, because they're kind of like the next step in the soil food web to really break down the fungi and the bacteria. Micropods, arthropods, things like that, you can get them in your soil, but they're harder to really keep in the soil versus protists, because protists are so small that they can't really escape, where like microarthropods can leave the soil and come back. And so there's kind of a few things like that, when you're doing the soil food web or living soil, you're looking to make sure that you're continuing to try to add. Lactobacillus is one of them that kind of help break down things. Trichoderma is another one that kind of keeps things in check, but trichoderma can outcompete and eat up a lot of food for other biology. So it's always important on watching the amount of trichoderma, because they are a competitor for food. And so the only thing that really keeps them in check that I know of is certain lactose strains of bacillus to keep some of the trichoderma in check. But yeah, you have to watch some of these other biologies you're putting in, because they will overconsume some of the food and not even allow the other biology to eat it.
And again, that brings us back to balancing things as best we can on inputs. If
So
if we start balanced, then it's easier to keep it there. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to start talking about like root bound pots. And because a lot of people growing in 1-gallon pots are plastic containers, even air pruning pots, such as fabric pots, have a hard time understanding that plants can become root bound and no longer take up nutrients. And so this is part of that nutrient cycling, that the root zone is very important for that nutrient cycling. And so when we're starting off like seedlings and solo cups or 1-gallon pots, we can leave nutrients in there. We can top feed, we can dress, but plants will outgrow the containers and keep growing over themselves, that there is no room for them. That look, their intention is to grow straight down, not around and around in a plastic container. And some of these will be so full of roots that it literally suffocates them from uptaking nutrients. Air pots are great fabric pots to help air prune, but if you leave plants in there long enough, they could consume all the soil in that pot, because that's how many roots that they've grown. But that becomes root bound over time. Even a year or two in a pot, you take that root ball out and you see that that's almost like a solid ball. Root bound is very real, and some people, they have a hard time grasping that concept. But there's a lot of research out there about it.
And to your point, I'll provide a practical example of that too. I have a Meyer lemon tree here. It's actually right behind me in the green screen. Anyway, that got root bound about 2 years ago. And I left it root bound because I just didn't want to push it to a bigger pot. And I just this fall transplanted it into a little bit bigger pot. I just kind of shaved back on the edges of roots to stimulate new root growth. And since I put it in that new pot, that thing has taken off. It went into full-fledged flower, developed fruits. It went through that cycle. I pushed it because the photo period is back in summer photo period. And now it's back in vegetative growth and growing rapidly. And it had stalled growth for 2 years solid. And that was due to being root bound. So that's a practical example of just how much an effect it can have. It totally stops growing.
I think at some point.
Well, they've also found different grow containers that hinder root growth properly. When you transplant it into another container, that root ball stays the same size and really doesn't grow out into the pot, because it's been restricted by the first pot. And that's why they talk about trying to like air prune the root tips, so you can get multiple tips as leaders going down. And so when you look at trees, for a great example, because people try to compare cannabis to trees, when they're growing in certain containers, that they get 1 or 2 leaders that come out and just circle it, and they go to put them in the ground, and then they start growing. All of a sudden a big windstorm comes, blows the tree down, because the root ball didn't ever grow into the ground like it was supposed to. And so a lot of people don't get this growing in different potting containers. They do the same thing with your plants. They restrict the root ball from growing into the other soil, and they will stay in a little ball and they won't grow into that soil medium. And your plant will become weak and not want to grow properly.
You took just exactly what
I see you over there shaking your head.
yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say, to be honest with you. It's very true. The roots and trees are a great example. That root almost goes down as tall as the tree unless it's hit something and diverts it. Those roots laterally go out as far as the branches stretch out. You know what I mean? They do. Same thing with your plants, that is a lot of their stability and their reach. When you put them in a pot, you're taking that away from them 100%. I've always, what you kind of talk about, you were talking about plants in, organics and soil, which again, when we talk about pots, I kind of think living soil, that kind of short circuits me a little bit because now I think of living soil more of a long term. You're not fucking flipping that. You're not transplanting it. It's going the distance. So when we talk about, living soil and pots, it kind of blows my mind. But this is what I want to say about the roots. I've always used that to a measure of how well I've done. Over the years, I've said this 1,000 times, man. It doesn't matter how good of the weight I've produced. If I take that motherfucker outside after the fact that I've chopped it down and I flip that pot out in the yard and I start stomping that thing out and there's plenty of fucking soil left in there. The roots haven't hit the edges. It hasn't curled that pot a little bit. I think, well, fuck, I had a lot of room for improvement in this strain. You know what I mean? I could have used a smaller pot. I could have did this. You know what I mean? Those roots tell me a lot more about my success than the yield of that plant.
And to your point on that, on my farm, when I was farming, when I plant a large crop, a group of something, whether it's tomatoes or peppers or whatever the frick it is, I go back about a month later and I go down every 10th or 15th plant and I dig down in that root system. I see, are those roots reaching out and establishing? Because if they're not, I'm doing something wrong. And if I'm doing something wrong, I want to catch it early and fix it. So yeah, that root point is super important. And that root bound thing you're talking about is very important. And honestly, like you can fix that. Like you can't fix the loss that you've had in growth, right? But you can scratch those roots up on the outside and rough them up and rough the bottom of the roots up on that pot and give them a reason to look out into that new soil when you transplant it. So they will seek into the new soil. And that's important.
Oh, and another thing I want to say about them roots real quick. Me and Smiley, I know me and Smiley's talked about this. I've kind of that root system to me, especially if you're going to take it to outdoors, is super important. Taking a clone outdoors, I don't think you're going to get everything you would have gotten if you would have went seed to soil. Let that tap root go as far and deep as possible. But I've kind of thought about, if you were going to take plants started indoors and put them outdoors, the perfect way for that transfer for me would to be in long. We've all seen cement tubes. So why couldn't we have like a quickly biodegradable cement tube that in tall, 3 feet, 3 feet by fucking 20 inches, or you know what I mean? You can get bits that are pretty wide these days. So why couldn't you let that tap root go nuts, and then when it come time, you just drop that cylinder in the hole, just like, you know what I mean? You're fucking building a pole barn, just drop it right in the hole, kind of backfill a little bit. You're good. That thing's gonna go. You've got, you know what I mean? I would think that would be an amazing system for them to go indoor out.
So there's tricks using different pots to actually get different leaders where it starts to shoot out and hit like a certain part of the pot itself, almost like root pruning, air pruning. But once it hits that little tip, that point, it will shoot out 2 leads and start going another direction. And what that will do is cause the main root tap to develop several more root taps as the main course and not just one. So using these type of pruning pots will help when you're going from a smaller pot into a larger pot over time, especially if you're trying to move outdoors. Because if you can get more root leaders,
Don't judge don't judge his clothes.
exactly. That's perfect. That pot is perfect for air pruning your leaders. Taking that from that pot to an outdoor over time will have your plant more in a solid plastic pot.
Yeah,
Yep.
I use the easy swap pots. They're like a fabric, that button on the side, they're square. Um, every time I transplant with those, I don't see root wrapping. I see all the roots pointing out at me like little fingers on the side of it. So it's like a ball of little white fingers hanging there. So it's a big difference when you go to transplant. Those are all ready to explode versus where it's like wrapped around in that plastic. That's the one benefit I've seen from it. The difficult part is that the roots actually do grow into the side. So when you peel it apart, sometimes it's like Velcro, like peeling the Velcro. But I prefer that versus ever trying to have it root on. And then scoring them is the part. The other part I was thinking too is the roots are going to grow wherever they're cut. They're just going to branch off from wherever they were cut too. So without going, you don't have to go real nuts, but you definitely want to give them some spots to branch off from.
So you just like difference in pots real quick. First of all, I love those air pots. I've been using and I've had those air pots for at least 15 years. Every one of them from them half gallons to I've had the big boys. And
You got yours back now.
yeah, I got that one back. Still got all of them. I still have all of them to this day. They work well. But I see Carlton's that 1 gallon there. And I've noticed this over the years because I am a bit of a cheap fucker. Okay. And I bought plants for the outdoors, and you get those 1 gal, you know what I mean, pots that come in there in different sizes. And I've been very guilty over the years to washing them up and reusing them. But what I'm getting at here is I have most certainly over the years seen a difference in same strain from a nursery pot to that fucking thin plastic, Miracle Grow pot or whatever it was that I got from Home Depot or whatever. There was a fucking difference. And I've always wondered if that pot isn't leaching something. You know what I mean? That
You're onto something there, Eagle, because
most of it's the air pruning.
I
The air pruning of the pot itself, once the tip shoots out or hits the air, it stops. And then it will shoot out a bunch of tips from that tip. And so when you see multiple like air pruning pot root zone versus plastic pot, you will see that has a much bigger root base because of all the root fiber, the tips coming out of those air pruned tips versus one that's in a plastic pot that doesn't really hit air to keep pruning itself, where it's just like a few liters just continuing to circle the pot until it hits air.
Yeah.
And so that is what really makes the difference is the air pruning technique of those pots versus just the solid plastic nursery pot, which if you watch some of the research on like root zones, it's tremendously huge at these air pruning, what they do to the root zone just compared to those plastic ones. Like when you see the root ball when it's done, holy but Jesus, the amount of roots.
Yep. It's interesting though, because I just got rid of probably 100 AirPods because I wanted to go to a system that was less of a pain in the ass, and I found those are just a pain in the ass to work with. Having to undo that little tab and undo the pot, take the bottom out. Now I've got 3 pieces to keep track of. Like I went back to 6-inch pots. And what I do instead of air pots is I just transplant up way before I need to. And I keep ahead of the root system. I do that on all my plants and try to keep ahead as much as possible. And I've even, you see my crates here in the background, there's like 10-gallon soil crates, right? And I've even went out and bought 20-gallon soil bags that, like the tomato there on the far corner, I had to bump that up. I think it was just the roots were just out of hand. I'm watering it twice a day with 1.5 gallons of water. Like at a point, you just gotta like give it more space and more choo-choo, right? So
Well, trying to transplant from 3-gallon fabric pot to a larger fabric pot, have you seen how hard it is? Or if that fabric pot is sitting on the ground in soil, the roots are literally going to grow through it into the soil, seeking more because there's nothing to air prune it right there.
I usually don't use the fabric pots, but like I had to go to something bigger, and I was like, I'm not gonna go buy a 40-gallon freaking crate for $50 a pop. So I was like, all right, airbags. I'm in the grow tent. It's not gonna like rot into the ground or anything here. But yeah,
My gauntlet with the fabric pots, the smart pots, and I've always been, on the artificial side. So cleanliness to me is fucking. I'm washing my pots in between. Yeah, what I'm dumping, I'm cleaning every time, and the fabric pots never got as fucking clean as I'd like them. And when I did see shit on them, I started to freak out, man. Some of them good science too. Sometimes you would see, using some organic nutrients and shit. You'd see the little occasional mushroom or something. You're like, that fucker's got to be clean. That's proper in this system. And I could never, so yeah, fabric pots just never clicked with me. I couldn't wash them. It just bugged me, man. So that didn't jive.
So Ned Denver in chat says he has a bunch of those air pots for sale if anybody's looking for some. And he says he's got all kinds of different sizes. So if you guys are on Instagram and you guys are looking for some air pots, hit up Ned, see how cheap he wants to get rid of them.
I'll tell you why I got rid of them, Ned. You asked the question here. Let me just answer that quick. I ended up taking them to the damn dump and paying to get rid of them. And I have to tell you, I'm so glad that I didn't buy those freaking things. A friend of mine gave them to me. I probably threw away $1,500 worth of AirPods. And I'm going, Jesus, man, it's heartbreaking. But like I couldn't sell them on Facebook Marketplace for $50. So I said, chuck them.
More and more people start to use them, to be honest with you, those AirPods, at least the ones that I showed, and great results. And I think they do have a place. I think I've always thought they would be amazing, and they do make collars for them now for like a flood drip system for cocoa. You know what I mean? They're a perfect spot for cocoa. They keep that balance very nicely. Maybe not so great with soil, but fucking cocoa, amazing. And with that drip there, I thought, man, that would be pretty sweet. You know what I mean? Or a flood and drain system. Them pots would be pretty well do well too. So
that would make a huge difference in those two. That was one thing I found that was difficult with them was management of water. You had to water from the top and you had to go real slow and let it soak down through, in order to get that sinusoidal water cycle you want to see. And so I found it was between the pain in the butt for changing them, having to keep track of 3 pieces and that.
Such thing as dry back and them motherfuckers. You'll never get that thing watered. You have to go bottom feed. If they get too dry, you have to let it soak up and get a little moist and then water from the top. They're very
They're gas when it comes to that. And that's why I was like, I just can't. I don't have the time and energy to spend on this. The amount of time and energy I'm pissing away on this, I could do 30 other things and be more efficient. So that's why I dished them. Not because they didn't perform, because they did perform. I even started tomatoes in them one year and man, they blew up. They did great. So they performed. They're just a little more work that I don't know what to do. Other thing was on your point about cleaning. I found they're difficult to clean because of all those little holes and crevices on them. Whereas that smooth pot, I can go over that with a sponge and some soap and rinse it and I'm out.
A tub of fucking vinegar, water, literally a big old tub and a big old wide bristle brush. It's how I always did them. Yeah.
So here's a seedling that's more of a vegeling. It hasn't quite showed sex yet, but it's been in a pot just about a month. Let me pull it out. I got to kind of squeeze the sides because the roots are so like down in the bottom. They're getting where they're starting to spin around, and they're starting to kind of get not quite root bound because they're not fully grown up into the top part of the soil yet. But as they just keep spinning and spinning, they're going to start looking all white. The dead ones are kind of going to be brownish. But when this whole thing fills up, that's a root bound pot. And like I can break all this up down here in the bottom of it to help it. But that's kind of the bad thing about you can already see how it's been circling around the bottom, trying to find to penetrate to get further in the ground. And so that's a big reason why, like understanding the growth of the plant and the size of pot really makes a difference on knowing when to transplant your plants.
As I was kind of pointing out earlier, too, man, some strains, as we talked about, some are heavy eaters, some are not. Some are, you know what I mean? Some strains just don't need that bigger pot. And you know what I mean? You experiment with that in your grows. And, when you're doing your, the end of the run, you chopping, you dumping out that pot, man. If it isn't, I mean, it's nice to have space, but if you can downsize too. I think you're in.
Well,
With that being said, if you don't have roots in that pot that have, you know what I mean, taken over it, now watering is becoming a problem. You know what I mean? Now you're not necessarily finding that sweet spot. You're treating it just like anything else. But over there, sucking it up. Well, I don't know. Well, it doesn't have the roots. It could be better off in a 5 gallon, not a 7. You know what I mean? And thrive. So
Here's a plant that I just bumped up, like I think maybe 4 or 5 days ago. It went from a 6-inch pot up to this 1 gallon pot. And that's because the roots, I cloned this 3 weeks ago at most. And the roots were already popping out of that 6-inch pot out of the bottom. And I was like, oh shit, we got to get it up to another pot. I bumped it up to this a few days ago. I'm probably going to have to throw this in a big crate in another. I probably can't go much more than a week before it's ready to bump over again. That's
about depth of the container. Is that a thing? Are we growing too shallow for some of the trees that I mean, because we're limited to what we can buy. Some always taught tall.
well, the taller the container, the deeper the root zone. So yes, that is, but nobody really makes deep containers for cultivation, which is the problem we have. There are a few out there that make a pot that's a few inches deeper, but it's like really 2 inches. Is that really going to help me?
the problem I run into with deeper, unless I go outdoor, is I don't have the headroom to go deeper because then I run out of vertical space. So that's why I don't care so much about
I'm sorry, go ahead, Carl. Time.
I don't care so much about vertical of depth because I can't get the height anyway. And actually, I'm using that on like the sweet corn I have in one of the tents right now. I'm using soil depth as a height limiter because the sweet corn's already, at the top of the light and it's not even into flower yet. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, honestly, but
what
so
about
not to go as deep?
A process of like up potting? I've went through that phase as well, where you're expecting or wanting a deeper root system, and and that provides a twofold that I found is it kind of hardens off as that soil folds back every time you up pot. The roots kind of harden up and almost become like their own little plant system. You know what I mean? So is up potting a way to cure the lack of pot depth that we're seeing? Can we, you know what I mean, through these transplanting, can we be building taller, deeper root systems each transplant?
Well, it's helping the roots go horizontally, not necessarily vertically down like we're looking for. So when we go to a larger container, you are allowing a few more inches of depth, but basically they're going more horizontally. But so I can stay in a 1 gallon container. I can keep top dressing. I can keep doing different feeds like nutrient tea feedings, and I can flower in this through the whole life of the pot. Because a lot of people, oh, well, you can do this. Yes, I can. But the original part of this conversation was root bound plants will not uptake nutrients over time. And so, yes, I can stay in this and keep dumping nutrients on it. But when my roots become so bound in such a small container, my plant's going to start having problems with nutrient uptake. And so that's why we're talking about transplanting into a bigger container to keep the root zones from becoming too bound in a plant. And what is the term bound? Where they're restricted, they can't move. And so going and transplanting to air pots or bigger pots is going to allow our plants not to have those issues.
Let's talk about roots again for a second while we're on the topic, because it's important. A truly healthy plant should be 80% of its biomass in roots. That means 4/5 of that plant's biomass is root in the soil. That means we're only looking at 1/5 of that plant up top. So think how much space that plant needs in there for its roots, for a truly healthy plant to really thrive and really express its full genetic capacity. That's a lot of root space. So when he talks about root bound, we're not talking about just root bound. We're talking about limiting the volume that the plant can actually produce in roots, which is what supports the whole function of that photosynthetic process. Again, just trying to paint broad picture concepts here so you can help understand the details we're covering.
So that it makes perfect sense to me. But how do the oddities, let's say, is like Rockwill work? You know what I mean? Where you're not getting as massive root systems as a pot, and yet kind of getting as big of plants. How does that? Is it just the laziness and constant there?
Well, I think what you're doing in rock wool or anything where you're supplementing those liquid nutrients is you're compromising a root system for an anionic nutrient system. That's what you're doing. You're substituting out the biological system where the plant and the root does the work, and you're supplementing that with basically prepackaged electrons is effectively what you're giving it.
But wait a minute. If you look at a DWC versus Rockwool, look at the fucking root zone and deep water culture. They get massive, huge. There's a lot of oxygen happening in that. So what are they doing? They're pruning themselves when they get hit by oxygen, and then they get more root tips that shoot off. Rockwool, you're limited in that cube that you're growing in. So when you have the plastic covering on it and it shoots out and it grows down and it finally hits air, it's going to root prune itself, and it's going to keep just building in that small container. And that's all it's going to do. So the volume of root versus the plant size, like force feeding, you're going to get a big plant in a small pot. We've all seen that over decades of people growing.
So why do
you're not getting the root size.
So why do we see the difference between DWC and Rockwool in yield? Well, you're going to see more yield in DWC because you're going to have more root mass, right? And more access to nutrient as a result.
See different types of roots too. Don't we, mean in different systems, long, stringier roots and, more of a flood and drain, thicker roots in the Rockwool, because it's trying to push through a thicker medium, a denser medium. It forms a thicker, more carrot-like root versus the lazier roots that we see, less fish bony kind of You know what I mean? How does the plant? It's weird how the plant adapts and knows that. You know what I mean? It's a pretty intelligent system to decide which. I mean, is that just epi
Well,
right there? You know what I mean? Which
think
type?
about what the roots are trying to do, Eagle. They're searching for water. So if your water source is there constantly, your roots aren't going to shoot out far to find it. And they're not going to keep growing to find water. Growing in soil and mediums kind of help your roots look for when they're drying out for a water source or nutrient source. When your nutrients and everything are in like a nutrient film technique or rock wool and the nutrients and water source is right there, they're not going to grow that far. They're not going to go out searching for this stuff as in other mediums.
I kind of see it as those longer, skinnier ones being able to be searchers, basically get into smaller spaces, and then the more fishy bone aspect of the roots being, kind of establishing themselves, trying to hold themselves where they're at and branch out for more. And then what I mean. They found what they're looking for. Now move out, boys. Is the way I kind of see, the different thicknesses of roots and why they do what they do a little bit.
Well, that's again another example of a gene expressing itself based on the environment it's set up in, right? Whether it's the roots or the leaves or the stems or the flowers, all of that expression is affected by that environment in every way.
Well, and Dr. White was talking about that with the rhizophagy cycle too, that the plant hairs are actually originating from the roots expelling that bacteria back out into the soil.
They talked about how that root structure is entirely different between soil with a rhizophagy and the soil without it. Yeah, massive difference in root structure, style, growth, all of it. It's all totally different.
Yeah, and those hairs are exactly what Eagle was saying. Go on and search in the finer spaces. They're expanding that surface area. It definitely makes for. I personally, I'm happy when if I'm taking a transplant of a cutting or something, and I'm looking at that root and I see a bunch of hairs coming off it. To me, I feel like, yes, this thing's going to take right off. And you always kind of, I wonder if it's not got something going on.
Same here. And another point on this transplant thing too, when I do transplants, I don't water them right away. I wait a day or 2 or 3. If I can get 3, I will, because they'll seek out that nutrient and moisture in that new soil. And if you water them right away, you're giving them that shit right there. It's like, I don't got to go anywhere. I don't got to look for nothing. It's
well, you can also bottom feed.
Joint, and I'm good.
You can water from the bottom to start looking for water, because bottom watering will draw roots down searching for the water instead of doing it on top, where then it's all wet up here and it's still kind of dry at the bottom, so they're staying towards the top of the pot. But bottom watering kind of reverses that, where it's drawing up the water from the tray, making the bottom of the pot wet, and it's going to cause the roots to go down. I usually search for it. Go
ahead.
I was just going to say, so bottom watering when you
jump in, I want to great on this shit. Basically, fucking. Damn. No, I fucking. Go ahead. I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, so I was just going to say I don't bottom water anything, just because that's not how I operate here. But I do ensure that soil that I'm transplanting to is adequate moisture. And in doing that, when I transplant those transplants, I make sure they're just a little on the drier side, so that they're not totally dried out yet, but that they're on the dry side and they start seeking that moisture soil in that new transplant.
I remember what I was wanting to say. I do pretty much. I'm right there with you, Carlton, on that transplant. I prefer not to just water for a couple of days. I like to go into a moist medium. I like to wait till my transplant is dry and kind of ready to release from my pot. So it's a quick bam, you're dry, into the moist pot, go look for water. If that soil is already dry because, it's not always what we want it to be. You know what I mean? If I'm transplanting into a soil medium that's already dry, I'm going around the edge, near the edge of the pot. I'm like you say, I'm gonna make them look for it. I ain't gonna water the base of the plant. It's around the edge. Good, we're on the same note on that transplant, 100%. Make
I
them.
I do the same thing. I'll do the water around the edge, like you say, if the plant's a little too dry. Same concept though. Yeah, balance that moisture. Let the plant seek what it's after.
One of those things that I always learned from I learned it from Tyke, and I've seen it echoed through many of these YouTube videos, was to take a pot that was similar to the one I was transplanting in. That one gal buried in the soil, tap, tap, tap. And then you take the one that you're going from, you pull that one out, sprinkle microbes in that fucking soil, you do around the root ball, you go right, bam, right into that hole. A little bit around the edges. There you go, girl. And it's just like that. Wham! Before that root ball falls apart or anything happens.
Slam dunk.
Well, some of what we were taught, Eagle, was also making sure when you transplant, you leave the top part of that root ball exposed. So everything's like a mound and the water doesn't stay on top of that, but runs to the side, causing the roots to search outwards. And that's why when people talk about watering your pots, you water the outside of the pot, kind of getting the roots to search for that as well.
At some point we need to talk about too, like the state of the plant too, because not only like if you're going from a solo cup that necessarily hasn't been super established, you know what I mean, and you do this, or you plan up a little bit. Root riot cubes are terrible for this. If you start a seed in a root riot cube and you leave a little bit of that root riot cube above ground or soil, that cube's gonna dry out way fucking quicker than anything around it, and your seedling's gonna struggle. You know what I mean? You keep that thing buried below, and it will function properly. If you bury it up high, it won't, things don't work right. So not sometimes, if you're going, it's not always good to go, up a little bit because it will wick a little bit. Your roots don't necessarily transfer. It only in a certain, if the roots are out there and healthy and kicking, but it's sometimes if they're barely established, you know what I mean? It may not make it if that plant's not suited or, ready for that up pot. It can be difficult sometimes like that. Anyways, I don't mean to cut this off, but man, we managed to roll through another episode, 9 o'clock. I want to wish you guys a very Merry Christmas for one. Moreover, your fucking patience and keeping this thing alive, at least with me, because I've done a horrible job trying to keep this. You know what I mean? You guys have kept this together, and that's why at one point earlier today I did kind of camera off a little bit, man. uh you guys are the heart and soul of this, really. I want to give credit where credit's due here. Most of the knowledge, all the knowledge is coming from these three squares and, what's coming out of your mouth. I'm just kind of, pulling it out of you. And, at some points in my life right now, I've got a lot of shit going on and I have been terrible, terrible about trying to keep this together, organized, be even keeping in touch with you guys about, what could be this week. You know what I mean? Even if you guys, but you guys held it down, stuck together, communicated. And I appreciate you guys 100% for, your dedication to keep this thing going and continue to dump, you guys' knowledge into the community. I got a shitload of respect for you guys, and that's no fucking joke. So I appreciate you guys.
Oh yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, oh yeah, Merry Christmas, man. So I like doing this. It's kind of cool. Get diving deep into some of the soil shit. It's hard to come up with topics all the time too. So like I don't know, people in chat got ideas too.
Not really. There's a lot of conversation, Smiley,
Yeah, yeah.
we can have. We just start a conversation and it will get going, really.
Yeah.
As long as we don't repeat ourselves too much, I just don't want to. I don't want to bore anybody. As long as we're keeping it fresh and keeping the conversation good, and people are learning from it, and we're learning from each other, that's great. I've really been enjoying this. I really look forward to this. Uh, you know, these are great conversations, guys. These are conversations I don't get to have with too many other people. There's very few people I can talk on this level with, and so I really appreciate that. And I especially appreciate you for hosting us, Eagle, and for providing a place for us all to get together and talk about this sort of stuff. So thank you.
I feel like I'm dragging this project down, but I appreciate you guys for, continuing to keep pushing it forward and, pounding some of this knowledge in my head, man. I was talking with Miss Angel the other day. I'm like, man, you don't know how many of these books I've listened to, and at some points, it's literally like shit throwing shit against the wall. I can't fucking get none of this shit to stick. I'm trying, fellas, and at some points, it is. I can listen to a lot of books, but it is the conversations, the questions. You know what I mean? I can't stop the book and go, why? And I can see you guys at some point going, oh shit. All right. We'll pause. This is why. So I do, man. I appreciate you guys' patience for, continuing to help, push this forward, man. I hope you guys have a Merry Christmas, and I look forward to the next episode, guys.
Yeah, I hope everybody has a happy holidays, and hopefully in another 2 weeks, if Eagle doesn't forget, we'll hopefully be back to get you guys, maybe, because I know Smiley was trying to get a guest on, but we'll see.
Totally fucked it up, and it was a good guess too.
I was trying to look what 2 weeks is. That'd be the 5th. There we go.
Cool. I'm gonna set a bi-weekly reminder on my phone.
We'll get it rolling. That'll be like a New Year's resolution, right? Like, bam, every 2 weeks.
Right on. Well, thank you guys for hanging out. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Happy holidays, everybody. Cheers.
Don't forget to do something nice for somebody. Random acts of kindness do save lives.